Hi everybody, welcome to IndyCar on Friday the 19th of July. I'm Gordon Ross and three items of news today for you. One story which is currently ongoing regarding the building of Scotland's ferries for the Outer Isles and the contract overruns for that. Our second story today deals with the reporting, or rather the misreporting, of the drug death statistics in Scotland by the mainstream media. And the third story today is another debunking story about, what shall we say, Better Together or Scotland in Union, whatever you want to call them, but the unionist scare story that house prices in Scotland are taking a tumble because of the continuing fears, if you want to put it that way, that there will be an independence referendum. So another story, another myth to be busted today. But first, the important news story today has emerged that the Ferguson shipyard in Gourock, which is building two ferries for CalMac for the Western Islands run, the contract has run into trouble because the Scottish Government, which placed the orders for the two ferries, did so in a rather unusual way. And what they did was they set up an intermediate company to place the orders for the ships. In this company, the job of the company was to set the specifications for the ship and then put it out to tender. So what that means is that an intermediate company set up at arm's length by the Scottish Government decided what size the ship should be, what fuels it should use, how long it should be, how many passengers and cars it was supposed to carry, and so on. All of those specifications would have been put out as the design of the ship. Now, Ferguson Marine bid for the contract based on what they read from that specification. And this story has been rumbling on, by the way, since last year, when it emerged that there had been over 600 design revisions made by this intermediate arm's length company, who changed the specifications on multiple times. Now, when you change the specification of something as large as a ship, it means that you often have to redesign whole other parts of the ship to accommodate that. One of the major redesigns was originally these ships were meant to run on a combination of either diesel fuel, which is a conventional fuel for shipping, and liquefied natural or petroleum gas. Now, it's emerged that the government's company, intermediate company, decided against using this biofuel, in other words, using two fuels instead of one, simply because CalMac had pointed out to them that the fueling for liquefied petroleum or natural gas facilities just didn't exist in the Western Isles. So that changed immediately. The ship went back to being diesel. And since then, the costs of these ships have spiralled to almost double the original contracted price, prompting the Scottish Government to step in and suggest that it might be necessary for the Scottish Government, which already holds a small stake of some 30, I think, I'll check the figures, if I remember, it's something like £30 million worth of shares in the company is owned by the Scottish Government. I'll get an accurate figure perhaps later on. But the point being that the Scottish taxpayer owns a little bit of Ferguson Marine anyway, and the company, which was rescued from disaster by Clyde Blower's Jim McCall some years ago, and has been vastly modernised with help from the Scottish Government to create modern construction facilities, laser cutting equipment and so on, computer-aided design, has all gone into this company to make it a world leader in civilian ferry building. The problem is that, like a lot of these arrangements where the government is both the customer and the seller, because if you think about it, the Scottish Government is trying to procure ferries for its own ferry service, but it owns a little bit of the business which makes the ferries. So it's in a position where it is both customer and provider. And this is always a problem area. If you remember, during the building of the Scottish Parliament, the actual structure of the building was changed numerous times because the politicians or the, if you like, the customers who wanted the building kept making changes to it. And that pushed the cost of the Scottish Parliament up to more than 10 times the original estimate. In the case of Ferguson's, what's happened is that the price of the ships, which was bid by Ferguson's based in good faith on what they thought the specification was, has changed so much that the timeline for building the ships has slowed right down and the costs have spiralled. And so the ship's now going to cost something like twice the original price. The Scottish Government is now having to look at the possibility of nationalising Ferguson's and bringing it into public ownership fully. Now, by doing so, they would get rid of this intermediate company problem that they have at the moment, and Ferguson Marine would essentially become the national shipbuilder, civilian shipbuilder of Scotland. It would be owned by you and me, and that would mean there would be no middlemen in this arrangement anymore, and possibly get rid of the problem of constant changes of specifications. Now, I think part of the problem here, because I used to work in industrial design, is just down to the fact that the Scottish Government doesn't have much experience of designing ships, and therefore, having created a company which specified what the ship should be, that this has created a lot of uncertainty over the design, and there's a lack of experience and wisdom in the procurement process. So if the Scottish Government does decide to buy up Ferguson's for the nation, then the company itself can make decisions about the specifications for the customer. The customer would then be CalMac, and CalMac would then say, we want a ship that does this, this and this, it has to be this size, it has to fit into this harbour. That will make the whole process far leaner and more efficient, and hopefully get rid of problems like this in the future. So I'll wait to see what happens in the next few weeks with this story. It's not necessarily a bad news story, but it does point out that there are difficulties in the Scottish Government's grasp of shipbuilding and how it works, and the arguments between Ferguson Marine and the intermediate company are going to rumble on for a while yet, and they're getting involved in legal arguments about who's responsible under the contract. The contractors are saying they had bid according to the specification. The specifications changed so much now that the original contracted spec is gone, and thereby exonerates them from having to meet the original price. So anyway, this I expect will rumble on for a few more months, but I would expect probably the Scottish Government to come to some arrangement with Ferguson's and perhaps buy a majority share in this shipyard to get rid of this intermediate company and produce a shipbuilding company which can basically design and build a ship from start to finish without constant interruptions and alterations by a third party. Anyway, leaving that story for now, that brings us to the story of Scotland's drug death statistics, which have been argued a lot about over the last few days since the BBC and other news outlets, including, incidentally, the mainstream news on the BBC's national channel, BBC One, which carried this story that Scotland's drug deaths were far higher than the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, when you look at the raw data, that's true. They are far higher, somewhere in the region of 1,100 deaths this year, as opposed to 800 last year. But if you start to dig into the statistics a little more, you find out that there are massive differences between the way drug deaths are categorised and recorded in Scotland and the way they're done in the rest of the UK. In Scotland, a drugs-related death can even be a car accident where somebody has a small amount of drugs in their system. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean the drug has caused them to die or have the accident. It just means that in any accident in Scotland, in a road accident involving injuries, blood tests are taken of the drivers to see if they were under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And if there was a presence of any drug in somebody's bloodstream, then it's recorded. And if there is a fatal accident, then it's classified as a drug-related death where drugs were a factor. So that statistic is entered into the Scottish statistics. So it's not just about people overdosing. It's about anyone who dies in any circumstance where drugs have been found in their bloodstream afterwards in autopsy. So the Scottish figures may be exactly the same as everywhere else in the UK if they were measured purely on overdose statistics. And then there is the issue of why there are so many overdoses in Scotland. What is happening to the heroin addicts in Scotland that is causing them to die off at such a rate? And the answer to that means travelling back in history to the 1980s. During the 1980s, most of Scotland's heavy industries were closed down by the Thatcher government, throwing thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, into unemployment and hopelessness. There were no jobs for much of the 1980s. For manual workers in Scotland, there was nothing. And many young people in Scotland, particularly men, took to drugs in desperation to escape their circumstances, the hopelessness of living in a sinking state with no work and no hope for the future. Many started to experiment with heroin and became addicts and have been addicts ever since. The effects of particularly heroin on the human body are such that it ages the human body far faster. If you remain an addict for decades, then you age much faster than a normal human being. And those of you who've driven through the poorer parts of Glasgow may have seen people who look like old men walking across the road very slowly, and you look closely at them. They're actually much younger than they appear, but they look to be at death's door. These are the heroin addicts who perhaps became addicted decades ago. Now, statistically speaking, they're far more likely to have things like heart attacks, liver failure, kidney failure, major organ failure, multiple organ failure, for any number of reasons. They're also far more likely to become sick because they lack vitamins and minerals and good hygiene and good nutrition. So statistically speaking, these men and women are far more likely to die young, and they do. And that boosts the statistics. So understanding how the drug addiction problem actually works gives you a much clearer insight as to why places like Glasgow and Edinburgh and the surrounding housing estates have such a high rate of drugs deaths. This is a historic problem where the people who became addicted decades ago are now dropping like flies because their bodies are so weakened by constant heroin use that they can no longer carry on. So the statistics are misleading. Some people are being classified as drug-related deaths because of a car accident, because of a fatal accident, because they've fallen, or because they've committed suicide even. Suicides involving any amount of drugs in your system are classified as drug-related deaths in Scotland. So it is not an overdose crisis necessarily. It's any death with any drugs involved of any kind. So just something for you to think about when the BBC is banging on about how much worse Scotland's drug deaths are than everywhere else. They're not. They are just recorded much better and in far more detail than almost anywhere else in the UK. Finally, I wanted to talk about another scare story which was being put about by various anti-independence groups, including Scotland and Union. And this is a story about a report which was written some time ago, which said that it was likely that this the threat, shall we say, in inverted commas, or the possibility of a second independence referendum was forcing house prices down in Scotland. Now, this was touted all over the media by the anti-independence campaigners as being evidence that another independence referendum was going to cause house prices to collapse. It has now been busted because the report's author submitted the report for publication, and it was rejected because it was rejected simply because, according to the people who were supposed to publish this report, and this is an academic report incidentally, peer-reviewed, said that it was poorly researched, it was inadequately researched, and therefore the conclusions that he drew about house prices couldn't be supported by the evidence. It wasn't well enough researched. Bear in mind that when you hear scare stories about house prices falling, that the Office for National Statistics this week has said that Brexit generally will cause the UK to slip into recession. But they have also said that it will cause house prices to fall, especially a no-deal Brexit. And this is not a report written by an obscure professor somewhere in a university in the middle of nowhere. This is coming from the Office for National Statistics, the UK's independent body which looks at the financial and economical implications of government policies. It's also relying on information not just from the OBR, but also from the International Monetary Fund, which has looked at the possible ramifications for a no-deal Brexit and any Brexit, even the softest Brexit. All of them have concluded that the UK will slide into recession no matter what kind of Brexit is done. Good or bad, there is really no good Brexit. But what they have said is that house prices will fall for certain if there is any kind of Brexit, because of the fact that investment in UK bricks and mortar housing will disappear. People will pull their money out of these bricks and mortar investments around London, everywhere. House prices are already falling in London, remember, and they had been skyrocketing continuously for the last 20 years or so, and now they're dropping already, and it hasn't happened yet. So the indications are there. And despite what this professor has said about house prices in Scotland supposedly going down because of the threat of Indy Ref 2, the real reason for house prices beginning to fall is nothing to do with independence. It is everything to do with the impending threat of Brexit. Anyway, that's about it for today's show. I'll be back again on Sunday, I hope, at some point. It might be a slightly compressed show on Sunday because I have rather a busy schedule on Sunday with work. But look forward to talking to you all then. In the meantime, remember, always question what is coming from mainstream television. Think about the things they're leaving out, and whatever the news story they're telling you, go online and research it properly and find out what the mainstream media is not telling you. I'll see you all later. Bye bye.